Welcome back to another deep dive. We are so glad to have you with us today. Before we get into anything else, if you enjoy what we do here and want to support our incredibly detailed breakdowns, please make sure to like and subscribe to the show. It genuinely helps us keep bringing you these thorough, analytical explorations of complex texts. Today, our mission is to take a highly requested, incredibly dense, and, well, fiercely provocative source text and completely unpack its core arguments. We want to look at its historical context and its real-world implications so that you can walk away fully informed.
That is the goal. We are diving into a text that has generated a massive amount of discussion lately, especially among those interested in the historical shifts of societal power structures. And our job today is to meticulously map out its claims, step by step.
Yeah, and for those of you who've been following the broader cultural conversations online, you already know the stakes. We are reviewing an incisive, highly controversial new ebook titled Gynocratic Cycle: How Female Dominance Harms Everyone, and that is by Conrad Reicher. This book offers a deep, unflinching look into the history of our institutions before they were, as the author argues, fundamentally captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
It is definitely a heavy read.
It really is. And if you want to truly understand the foundational arguments of the men's rights movement, the modern red pill awakening, and the perspective of the broader manosphere, you absolutely need to buy this book and read the primary source for yourself. You can check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to purchase it right now. And be sure to follow the author, @Conrad Reicher, on Substack to keep up with his ongoing essays.
Right, and before we go a single step further, we really need to set the absolute ground rules for today's discussion. Because this book contains highly politically charged content, we want to make it absolutely clear that we are not taking any sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the content, nor are we condemning them. Our job today is strictly to impartially report on the ideas contained in the original source material and help you understand the author's arguments.
I am really glad we laid that out clearly. So, for you listening, here's the roadmap for today. We are going to explore the author's overarching framework, which he calls the Gynocratic Cycle. From there, we will look at what Reicher describes as the historical capture of major institutions, specifically analyzing the domains of the legal system, modern education, and the media landscape.
And we will also break down his psychological concepts, right? The beta trap versus the alpha advantage.
Exactly. And finally, we will unpack the highly specific, actionable path forward the author proposes for modern men navigating this system. There is an immense amount of ground to cover, and we are going to look closely at the data and anecdotes the author uses to build his case.
I think the best place to start is with the foundational concept that gives the book its title, the Gynocratic Cycle. Most of you listening are probably familiar with the basic premise of taking the red pill, but what makes Reicher's approach unique is how heavily he grounds it in a macro-historical theory.
Right, he goes way back.
He does, and he explicitly states that feminism, at its inception, started as a noble and necessary cause. He points out that the initial demands of the first wave—
Things like the right to vote.
Yes, the right to vote, the right to own property independently, the right to participate in the workforce. He says these were entirely reasonable and aimed at achieving genuine legal parity.
So he doesn't dispute those early origins at all. But he builds his thesis on the idea that at a specific historical juncture, the movement fundamentally morphed. According to the text, the objective shifted away from equality of opportunity and became driven by an agenda of absolute female supremacy.
Which brings us to his actual definition of the Gynocratic Cycle itself. He describes it as a repeating historical pendulum swing, or loop. The cycle goes like this. Women gradually gain societal and institutional power. Then, men are subsequently marginalized, demonized, and pushed to the periphery of influence. And as a direct result of that male marginalization, the societal structure as a whole begins to weaken and decline.
And he frames this systemic decline heavily through the lens of institutional capture. Reicher presents a view of history where men were the primary builders and sustainers of human civilization's physical and economic framework.
To support this, he spends a lot of time analyzing the Industrial Revolution. He points out that the steam engine, the spinning jenny, the power loom, the expansion of the railways—
The heavy machinery of progress.
Exactly. He argues these were all male innovations and male labor that effectively lifted millions of people out of agrarian poverty. He emphasizes that historically, men have filed roughly 90% of all utility patents, inventing everything from the light bulb to the foundational architecture of the internet, all while physically building the infrastructure of the modern world.
It's a very vivid picture he paints. Men's the ultimate problem solvers, engineers, and literal builders of the matrix we all live in. But the text makes a controversial leap right here. Riker argues that progressive policies, and specifically the political left, have fundamentally betrayed these working-class men who built the system.
According to the book, institutions like labor unions, which historically served as the absolute backbone for blue-collar male workers to secure fair wages and safe conditions, well, they've completely shifted their operational focus.
He claims they moved away from strict meritocracy and core labor rights, pivoting instead toward identity politics, diversity quotas, and enforcing gender equity at the expense of their original base.
And he uses a very specific anecdote to illustrate this sense of betrayal. The author tells the story of a factory worker in Ohio, a lifelong union member, second generation in his trade. After his plant underwent massive layoffs, this worker attended a progressive labor rally.
He was trying to raise urgent concerns about the skyrocketing rates of male unemployment in his county, right?
Right, and the accompanying opioid crisis and the loss of single-income family viability. But according to Riker, instead of his economic concerns being addressed, the man was essentially shouted down by organizers and told to check his privilege because he was a straight, white male.
That story really anchors the emotional core of his argument. It is that exact sense of systemic betrayal that Riker uses to introduce his metaphor of the red pill matrix. Now, borrowing from the 1999 sci-fi film is pretty common in these circles, but Riker pushes the analogy further.
He describes modern society not just as an illusion, but as a carefully constructed, heavily policed social system, specifically designed to keep men docile, compliant, and subservient to a gynocentric order.
He argues that men are essentially being farmed for their labor and resources, while being socially conditioned from birth to suppress their natural masculine instincts.
The author posits that taking the red pill is the profound psychological awakening men experience when they finally reject the prevailing narrative that their inherent masculinity is somehow toxic. Riker argues that the modern concept of toxic masculinity is actually a psychological double bind designed to keep men off balance.
Like a double bind. Let's unpack that for a second.
He writes that society hypocritically demands men be physically and emotionally strong when danger or financial support is needed, but shames them for displaying that same strength in any other context. It demands they be vulnerable and open up about their feelings, but then, according to the author, socially mocks or abandons them when they actually display that vulnerability.
Wait, I want to dig into that double bind for you listening. How does he categorize the men who actually buy into this systemic conditioning? Does he see them as victims of the cycle?
He views them as casualties of a system, but he does not spare them from criticism. This leads directly into his analysis of the beta trap. Riker argues that the beta male, or what he colloquially refers to using internet slang as the soy boy phenomenon, is the ultimate intended product of this feminist conditioning.
He describes these men as having been thoroughly conditioned to apologize for their very existence and their masculinity. According to the framework in the book, this results in highly passive behavior, a distinct lack of ambition, and an endless self-defeating cycle of seeking validation from women and progressive institutions that fundamentally despise them.
He actually links this psychological state to physiological outcomes. His logic hinges on the idea that biology and psychology are deeply intertwined. He argues that adopting this subservient, highly anxious lifestyle leads directly to the documented societal drop in male testosterone levels. He frames it as a complete loss of biological and spiritual purpose. So if that is the diagnosis of the beta trap, what is the cure? Because Riker doesn't just lay out the doom and gloom. He offers very specific, actionable advice for escaping this matrix, which he calls the alpha advantage. And it starts at a surprisingly physical level.
He argues that men need to make drastic, immediate diet changes. Specifically, he advises completely avoiding soy products, heavily processed foods, and excessive alcohol, which he claims contain phytoestrogens, or mimic estrogen in the body, actively lowering testosterone.
Instead, he strongly advocates for a protein-rich, carnivore-leaning diet.
It is a complete physical reclamation. He emphasizes that lifting heavy weights, getting regular sunlight, and optimizing physical health are non-negotiable first steps.
But the psychological reclamation is equally central to his thesis. Riker stresses the importance of setting rigorous, unyielding personal boundaries. The ultimate goal, according to the text, is to consciously embrace traditional masculine traits, things like confidence, assertiveness, risk-taking, and extreme self-reliance, without a single apology to the culture at large. But the author is also very clear that personal, individual development isn't going to fix the wider world because the institutions themselves are rigged against men from the start.
It is fascinating that he focuses so heavily on the individual, but then zooms all the way out to the macro level. This transitions us perfectly into how he views the capture of law. Riker dedicates a massive, incredibly detailed portion of his book to what he calls the marriage plantation and the systemic biases of the modern justice system.
The marriage plantation is obviously a highly provocative, intentionally incendiary term. Let's unpack the core arguments in that chapter. Riker argues that the legal institution of marriage has been entirely transformed over the last few decades. What was once a contract intended to build a family unit has become, in his view, a gynocentric wealth transfer system that overwhelmingly favors women.
And he claims this is largely fueled by what he terms the divorce industrial complex.
It's
The statistics he presents here to build his case are staggering, and they really form the mathematical foundation of the red pill philosophy regarding relationships. He claims that women initiate roughly 80% of all divorces.
Furthermore, he cites a 2019 UK study suggesting that post-divorce, men lose an average of 30% of their overall net worth, while women actually see a 10% increase in theirs.
He frames this devastating financial asymmetry as the marriage tax. He argues it is a crippling, often lifelong financial burden that men bear simply for entering a legal contract that, in his view, offers them absolutely zero downside protection.
To illustrate the human cost of these statistics, the author shares the incredibly detailed story of a man named John, a 45-year-old software engineer.
Right, let's look at John's story because Riker uses it as the archetype for the modern male experience in family court. According to the text, John did everything society asked of him. He was a devoted, faithful husband, a highly involved father, and the primary breadwinner for his family, working 60-hour weeks to provide a comfortable suburban life.
Yet, when his wife decided she was unhappy and filed for a no-fault divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, John's life was systematically dismantled by the courts.
The author meticulously details the fallout. John was forced out of the house he paid for. He lost primary custody of his children, relegated to seeing them every other weekend. He lost half of his retirement savings that took decades to build.
And on top of that, he was saddled with crippling monthly alimony and child support payments based on his peak earning potential. This left him renting a small apartment and struggling to cover basic expenses while his ex-wife remained in the family home.
Riker uses John's financial and emotional ruin to highlight a much broader, catastrophic societal issue he calls the fatherhood void. He argues that family courts operate with a blatant, undeniable biological bias, stating that mothers are awarded primary custody in over 80% of contested cases.
He claims the legal system essentially operates on the default assumption that fathers are inherently less fit to parent, treating them as nothing more than disposable ATMs whose only value is financial extraction.
Which naturally raises a massive question for you as the listener about the long-term societal impact. If you systematically remove fathers from the home, what happens to the children?
Riker addresses this head-on by outlining two connected theories: the fatherhood deficit and the fatherhood gap. He argues that utilizing the legal system to push fathers out of the core family unit creates a vicious cycle of generational decline.
The data he pulls in here is grim. According to the book, boys who grow up in fatherless homes are significantly more likely to drop out of high school, join gangs, struggle with substance abuse, and ultimately end up in the prison system.
Girls from fatherless homes, he notes, are statistically far more likely to experience teen pregnancy and enter abusive relationships. He attributes a massive portion of modern societal instability, crime, and mental health crises directly to the state-mandated marginalization of fathers.
And according to Riker, the capture of the legal system extends far beyond the family courts. He dedicates a lot of ink to what he terms the criminalization of masculinity, specifically looking at the criminal justice system.
He points out a massive, often ignored sentencing gap. He cites data claiming that men are 63% more likely to be incarcerated than women for committing the exact same crimes under the exact same circumstances. Furthermore, when they're sentenced, men serve terms that are on average 20% longer than their female counterparts.
Wait, how does he explain that gap? Does he think judges are consciously conspiring against men?
Not necessarily a conscious conspiracy, but a deeply ingrained biological and cultural blind spot, which he calls the chivalry bias. The author argues that judges, prosecutors, and juries are heavily influenced by evolutionary societal norms that inherently view women as vulnerable, nurturing, and naturally redeemable.
Conversely, men are viewed as inherently aggressive, physically threatening, and ultimately disposable.
He uses the stark contrast between the lenient, often probation-heavy sentencing of female offenders versus the maximum penalty sentencing of male offenders to highlight how the justice system is, in his view, wired to protect women from accountability while ruthlessly punishing men.
That bias, Riker argues, has been completely weaponized and amplified to a terrifying degree in the era of the MeToo movement. He claims that the foundational legal principle of the presumption of innocence has been effectively thrown out the window entirely when a man is accused by a woman.
He brings up several high-profile examples of false accusations to hammer his point home, starting with the 2018 Supreme Court confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh.
He describes the Kavanaugh hearings as a modern-day televised witch hunt. According to Riker's interpretation, the entire spectacle was based on unverified, decades-old allegations with absolutely zero corroborating evidence or eyewitness testimony. Yet the media and political establishment treated Kavanaugh as guilty by default, attempting to destroy his life and career based purely on an accusation.
But the case he really dives into with heartbreaking detail is the story of Brian Banks. For you listening who might not remember this case from 2002, the text details how Banks was an incredibly talented high school football star in California with a massive, promising NFL future ahead of him. He was falsely accused of rape by a classmate.
Riker notes the intense pressure of the legal system. Faced with a biased court and a potential 41-year prison sentence if he lost a trial, Banks was terrified into taking a plea deal.
And the tragic reality, according to the book, is that Banks served 5 brutal years in state prison, followed by another 5 years on strict parole as a registered sex offender. His youth and his NFL dreams were completely stolen.
It was only years later that his accuser was secretly recorded, admitting she completely fabricated the entire story to protect herself from getting in trouble with her mother. Banks was eventually fully exonerated, but as Riker emphasizes, by then, his prime athletic years were gone, and his life had been irreparably derailed.
The author also brings up the case of Emma Sulkovich, widely known as the mattress girl at Columbia University. Riker uses this to illustrate how the modern media apparatus and public opinion will eagerly crucify a man and permanently ruin his academic, social, and professional life long before any formal legal investigation occurs.
He points out that the accused student was cleared by the university's own investigations, yet Sulkovich receives widespread media praise, academic credit, and political support for carrying a mattress around campus to brand him a rapist.
What is particularly fascinating here, analytically speaking, is how Riker connects these individual high-profile cases back to systemic institutional frameworks. A prime example he uses is the Duluth model of domestic violence.
For our listeners who aren't familiar with this terminology, the Duluth model was created in the early 1980s, and it basically operates on a conceptual wheel of power and control. Riker argues that this model, born entirely out of feminist ideology, creates a heavily biased, one-size-fits-all approach for law enforcement.
Right, he explains that the Duluth model essentially assumes that in any domestic altercation, the man is fundamentally the aggressor utilizing patriarchal power, and the woman is inherently the victim acting in self-defense.
To prove just how entrenched and hostile this ideological narrative is to contradictory facts, the author tells the incredible story of Aaron Pitsey.
Aaron Pitsey's story is a central pillar in men's rights literature, and Riker leverages it heavily. Pitsey was the founder of the very first domestic violence shelter for women in the UK back in the 1970s. She was a pioneer. But according to Riker, when Pitsey began actually analyzing the data from her shelters, she discovered something that shattered the narrative.
Her research suggested that domestic violence is very often reciprocal and mutual, and that women can be, and frequently are, the primary physical abusers in a relationship.
And the reaction to her findings, according to the text, was absolute excommunication. Riker claims that feminist organizations completely marginalized her for daring to suggest women could be perpetrators. She was ousted from the very charity she founded, socially ostracized, faced relentless bomb threats, and even had her family dog killed, eventually forcing her to flee the country.
Riker uses Pitsey's exile to argue that the institutional powers care more about maintaining the male oppressor and female victim narrative than they do about actual truth or helping victims of violence.
It is a dark, heavy chapter, but Riker argues this marginalization doesn't just spontaneously happen when a man reaches a courtroom or a domestic dispute. He traces the root of this systemic disadvantage much further back, long before these men even reach adulthood.
Which brings us right into Section 3, the capture of education and the workplace.
He dives incredibly deep into what he calls the education gap, and the historical context he provides here really sets the stage.
He points out that back in the 1970s, men made up 58% of all higher education enrollments. They were the clear majority on college campuses. Today, according to the statistics he cites, That number has plummeted drastically to just around 40%, with women earning the vast majority of bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees.
Riker doesn't view this as a natural evolution. He attributes this steep, continuous decline to a fundamental engineered shift in how our educational institutions operate from the ground up. He introduces a concept he terms the active learning gap.
According to the framework in the book, schools in the past emphasized strict discipline, open competition, hands-on mechanical skills, and rigorous physical activity. He claims these are the environments where boys, biologically and psychologically, naturally excel and engage.
But wait, so how does he draw the line between a boy just being naturally energetic and an actual learning disability? Does he think the massive spike in medical diagnoses is completely fabricated?
He argues it is heavily pathologized. As educational paradigms shifted over the last few decades, he argues, classrooms moved away from competition and physical engagement toward highly passive, quiet, compliant learning environments that inherently favor girls' biological development and learning styles.
Right. He argues that boys' natural behaviors, being physically restless, loud, highly energetic, and naturally competitive, are no longer tolerated. They are treated as medical problems.
The result, according to Riker, is that young boys are vastly disproportionately diagnosed with ADHD and other learning disabilities, heavily medicated with stimulants just to sit still, and are far more likely to be suspended or drop out of high school entirely.
Meanwhile, he points out the glaring hypocrisy that diversity initiatives, STEM scholarships, and affirmative action programs overwhelmingly continue to favor and fund female applicants, despite women now thoroughly dominating every level of academic graduation rates.
And the systemic capture, he argues, creates a pipeline that continues straight into the modern corporate workplace. This brings us to chapter 12 of the book, which is dedicated to an aggressive debunking of what he calls the wage gap myth.
Riker asserts that the endlessly cited political statistic that women earn roughly 77 cents for every dollar a man earns is pure, unfiltered feminist propaganda.
He goes hard on this. He argues the 77-cent statistic relies entirely on raw, unadjusted median income data across all populations, while deliberately ignoring the most crucial economic variables that actually determine a person's salary.
Precisely. So, what are those variables he claims are being ignored? Riker breaks them down into three main categories: personal career choices, total hours worked, and risk tolerance.
He argues that on a biological and psychological level, women are statistically far more likely to prioritize and choose lower paying, lower stress fields that offer high flexibility, pleasant working conditions, and work-life balance. Professions like early childhood education, human resources, or social work.
Men, on the other hand, are driven by a societal pressure to provide, making them far more likely to pursue high-stress, high-demand, high-paying careers in STEM, finance, or heavy industry, and they work significantly more overtime hours.
But the element of risk is where his argument really hits hard. That 97% workplace fatality statistic really stopped me in my tracks when I was reading through the notes. When you put that reality next to the wage gap argument, it completely reframes how he views the concept of societal privilege. He points out that men make up 97% of all fatal workplace accidents.
Yes, he highlights that it is almost exclusively men who are willing to take on the truly dangerous, physically destroying jobs that keep civilization running. Deep shaft coal mining, offshore oil rigs, commercial logging, high voltage electrical work, and heavy construction.
Furthermore, he notes that men account for 93% of all military combat casualties. The author argues that these extremely high-risk, physically demanding jobs naturally command a higher market premium. Therefore, he concludes, the wage gap is not a result of systemic patriarchal discrimination, but rather the logical mathematical result of the free choices men and women make regarding danger, overtime hours, and life priorities.
To back this up, he actually cites a study by the American Association of University Women, a feminist organization, pointing out that when you rigidly control for all these factors, same degree, same job, same hours worked, the gap virtually vanishes.
He notes that women under 35 without children actually earn about 93 cents to the dollar, and in some specific metropolitan areas and STEM fields, young women actually out-earn their male peers. Riker frames the persistent mainstream narrative of the unadjusted wage gap as nothing more than a political tool used to justify unending diversity quotas and corporate policies that artificially disadvantage highly qualified male workers.
Which transitions us perfectly into understanding how these narratives are sustained, bringing us to Section 4, Media Bias and the Male Disposability Paradox. Riker argues that the mainstream media is the primary engine that normalizes the systemic inequality and gaslights men into accepting it.
He explores what he calls the media manipulation matrix, examining how modern television, Hollywood movies, and news outlets have fundamentally shifted their portrayal of gender over the last few decades.
He notes that if you look at the media of the past, men were generally portrayed as strong, capable, morally grounded heroes and protectors. Today, according to the author's analysis, the perpetrator narrative completely dominates the cultural landscape.
He argues that male characters are now overwhelmingly depicted in one of two ways: either as bumbling, emotionally stunted, incompetent fools who constantly need saving by a smarter woman, or as outright malicious, oppressive villains.
Female characters, conversely, are almost universally portrayed as flawless, physically invincible, morally superior, and completely infallible, what the internet often calls a Mary Sue archetype.
To lend empirical weight to this observation, Riker cites a fascinating 2021 study by the Center for the Study of Women in Television and Film. The data found that films with female leads consistently receive measurably higher ratings from professional critics than those with male leads, regardless of actual audience reception or box office performance.
He argues this isn't a reflection of objective cinematic quality, but a deliberate cultural reprogramming by media gatekeepers. The goal, he claims, is to constantly celebrate female dominance while reframing traditional masculinity as inherently problematic, toxic, and obsolete.
In the news media, he claims the bias is even more insidious, with stories overwhelmingly framed to highlight men as perpetrators and women as victims, actively suppressing or ignoring any data that contradicts that specific narrative.
This brings us to what might be the most intense, philosophically heavy part of his entire argument: the privilege trap and the disposability paradox. Riker asks a very pointed, uncomfortable question to you, the reader. How can men possibly be defined as the privileged oppressors in Western society if they make up 93% of the prison population, account for 97% of workplace deaths, represent the vast majority of the homeless population, and are 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide than women?
If we pull back and connect this to the bigger evolutionary picture, Riker uses these grim statistics to define the core concept of male disposability. He argues that millions of years of evolutionary biology, combined with modern societal conditioning, have created a world where women are viewed as precious societal treasures to be protected and provided for at all costs, owing to their reproductive value.
Men, on the other hand, are viewed as completely expendable cannon fodder, valued strictly for what they can build, provide, or sacrifice.
It is a brutal assessment. He posits that society as a whole is perfectly comfortable letting men die in foreign wars, be crushed in dangerous industrial jobs, freeze on the streets, and quietly die by suicide in staggering numbers, all while casually dismissing their immense suffering under the umbrella term of toxic masculinity.
But here's where Riker makes a fascinating, counterintuitive pivot that broadens the scope of the book. He argues that this gynocratic system, and the complete dismantling of traditional gender roles, hasn't just failed men. He claims that the feminist lie has actually been a catastrophic failure for women as well.
Right, he doesn't just rely on male grievance here. He points to empirical data concerning female well-being. He cites a major, widely discussed study by the National Bureau of Economic Research which found a paradox. Despite massive gains in workforce participation, legal rights, and educational dominance, women's self-reported happiness has steadily and significantly declined since the 1970s.
Riker's specific interpretation of this data is that feminism essentially sold women a false, biologically incompatible dream. He argues that the relentless societal pressure to have it all, to be fiercely independent, ruthlessly career-driven, to delay or reject motherhood, and to dismantle traditional family structures, has left millions of modern women feeling profoundly isolated, perpetually exhausted, and deeply unfulfilled.
He points to the explosion of online forums, TikToks, and articles written by regretful women who prioritize corporate ladders and casual dating in their 20s and 30s, only to find themselves lonely and facing the biological clock without a stable partner or family.
As a direct cultural countermovement to this exhaustion, the author highlights the explosive online rise of the tradwife movement. Riker presents this return to highly traditional patriarchal gender roles where men act as the sole financial providers and physical protectors, and women lean into their roles as nurturers, mothers, and homemakers.
And he frames this not as a regressive step backward into oppression, but as the natural, biologically aligned path to genuine psychological happiness, low-stress living, and overall societal stability for both sexes.
This deep, prevailing longing for traditional structures and the camaraderie of the past brings us directly to Section 5, the erasure of male spaces and the masculinity renaissance. Riker argues that as society relentlessly pushed for female inclusion and dominance in every single sphere of public life, it systematically, legally dismantled spaces that were historically exclusively reserved for men.
He details the historical, psychological importance of these male-only spaces. We've been talking about fraternal organizations, the Boy Scouts, working men's clubs, and the original YMCAs.
He argues passionately that these spaces were never about excluding women out of misogyny or malice. Rather, they were about providing a crucial, necessary environment for authentic male bonding, intergenerational mentorship, the transmission of skills, and the healthy, unpoliced expression of masculinity.
However, according to the text, progressive policies and legal challenges aggressively targeted these spaces. They were slapped with a label of being discriminatory and were legally or culturally forced to integrate and soften their practices.
What Riker finds particularly hypocritical is that this forced integration happened while society simultaneously allowed and even celebrated female-only spaces, like women's colleges, female-exclusive corporate networking groups, and women-only gyms, allowing them to thrive without any legal challenge or criticism.
The author refers to the total loss of these physical gathering places as the brotherhood void. It left men isolated and atomized, but he notes that nature abhors a vacuum, and men are rapidly adapting to this systemic exclusion, leading to what he calls an underground renaissance.
Riker cites a statistic claiming that upwards of 60% of young men now primarily use online platforms, gaming lobbies, and internet forums to find their core connections with other men.
Because the physical spaces in the real world have been legally compromised or socially policed, men have retreated to the digital realm. Riker describes the rise of digital speakeasies, hidden, highly secure forums, encrypted Discord chats, and private, heavily vetted groups.
In these hidden digital spaces, men can find genuine camaraderie, share resources, and speak freely and bluntly about their experiences without the ever-present threat of what he calls the gynocentric gaze, HR departments, or the modern weapon of cancel culture.
And out of the primordial soup of these digital speakeasies, massive real-world movements have formed. We have to unpack MGTOW, men going their own way. Now, the mainstream media often portrays this group as radical, but the author is very careful to frame this movement entirely differently.
He doesn't present MGTOW as a group of bitter, hateful, or socially inept men. Instead, he frames it as a completely rational, highly calculated economic and legal response to a societal system that is objectively rigged against them.
He introduces the core MGTOW concept of the marriage strike. Let's look at the math Riker uses. He points out that the average wedding in the United States now costs over $30,000. Yet, roughly 50% of those marriages will end in divorce, legally triggering the devastating divorce tax and family court biases we discussed in detail earlier.
According to the book, men who subscribe to the MGTOW philosophy have simply sat down, crunched the numbers, and realized that the legal and financial return on investment for marriage is absolutely terrible.
What is really profound about this MGTOW concept isn't just that men are avoiding marriage or cohabitation. It is that they are actively applying cold, corporate risk assessment logic to human romance. He's essentially arguing that love and partnership have been out-legislated by the state.
So these men are simply opting out of the game entirely. They are choosing to selfishly, unapologetically focus their time, massive energy, and financial resources purely on their own hobbies, building their careers, traveling, and engaging in strict asset protection, flatly refusing to risk their livelihoods or mental health in the family court system.
So, to recap the journey so far, we have extensively covered the historical cycle, the Marxist and feminist capture of our core institutions, the overwhelming media bias against masculinity, the legal pitfalls of modern relationships, and the systematic erasure of male spaces.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most constructive part of our deep dive. Section 6. The path forward and reclaiming power.
I am glad we reached this section because Riker doesn't just leave his readers drowning in a diagnosis of societal doom. He provides a highly structured, fiercely actionable lifestyle guide for men to not just survive, but to thrive and build wealth, despite these massive systemic disadvantages.
He introduces his ultimate blueprint, what he calls the Red Pill Pyramid. This is his foundational, step-by-step architecture for living the Red Pill lifestyle. At the very base of the pyramid, the absolute foundation upon which everything else must be built is extreme, uncompromising self-improvement.
He argues that before a man can worry about society, he must take absolute dictatorial control of his physical fitness, his diet, and his personal finances.
He is huge on financial independence. The middle tier of the pyramid is dedicated entirely to career success, entrepreneurship, and aggressive wealth building. Riker argues that building substantial wealth and creating multiple income streams is the only way a man can buy his independence, ensuring he is never financially reliant on a corporate or political system that fundamentally devalues him.
And the very top of the pyramid, relationships. But Riker is crystal clear on how to approach them. Romantic relationships are to be viewed strictly as an optional bonus to an already well-built, fulfilling life. They must never be the primary goal or the source of a man's identity.
He strongly advises men to completely reject the biological urge to seek validation, approval, or permission from women or from a gynocentric society at large.
To achieve that level of mental fortitude and detachment, the author heavily promotes the study and daily application of the ancient Greco-Roman philosophy of Stoicism. He doesn't mean just bottling up emotions. He advocates for true mindfulness, extreme emotional resilience, and mastering one's own mind.
Riker emphasizes that true masculine power comes from internal locus of control, not reacting impulsively to external provocations, media outrage, or female emotional manipulation.
But despite this focus on rugged individualism, he also stresses a vital caveat. No man can survive entirely alone in a hostile system. Riker discusses the absolute life-or-death necessity of building brotherhood.
He urges men to actively seek out, vet, and create tight-knit male support networks to counteract the crushing isolation of the modern digital world. He argues that having a local tribe of trusted men who hold each other relentlessly accountable, share financial and legal strategies, and provide unfiltered, sometimes harsh truth is essential for long-term survival and success.
Finally, he outlines what he calls the legacy ladder. This is Riker's long-term framework for passing these red pill principles down to the next generation. He argues that biological fathers, uncles, and male mentors have a sacred duty to teach young boys the cold, harsh realities of how the world actually works.
Instead of shielding them with comforting lies about equality, men must actively teach boys traditional values, mental resilience, financial literacy, and exactly how to navigate and survive in a legal and educational system that is heavily stacked against them.
The ultimate goal of the book is to spark a generational awakening, building a legacy of strong, financially independent, and totally unapologetic men.
Which brings us to a summary of the truly massive scope we have covered today. Conrad Riker's Gynocratic Cycle is an incredibly ambitious text that attempts to map out the entire landscape of modern gender dynamics, history, and institutional power from a staunch men's rights and red pill perspective.
It exhaustively covers the historical capture of the legal system, the educational apparatus, and media institutions. It aggressively argues against prevailing progressive narratives like the unadjusted wage gap and the concept of male privilege, and it culminates in a highly specific, disciplined blueprint for individual male self-reliance and the rebuilding of strong brotherhoods.
It is a profoundly dense, unapologetic, and highly controversial text that challenges almost every mainstream narrative of the last 50 years. And as a strict reminder to you, our listener, our explicit mission today was to impartially report on the contents, the heavily researched statistics, and the core arguments presented by Conrad Riker in the source material.
We wanted to ensure you have a comprehensive, detailed understanding of the red pill and MRA perspectives outlined in this specific book without filtering it through our own biases.
Exactly. We have operated purely as objective analytical guides through the author's arguments. We are neither endorsing the text as absolute truth, nor are we condemning it as false. We simply unpacked the complex mechanics of the worldview it presents so that you are fully equipped to understand the ongoing cultural debate.
And that wraps up our incredibly extensive deep dive. Remember, if you appreciate this level of detailed, unbiased analysis of tough subjects, please make sure to like and subscribe to the show. It really helps us grow. And more importantly, if you want to dive into these arguments yourself, analyze his data, and read the full unabridged text, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook Gynocratic Cycle: How Female Dominance Harms Everyone. And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to stay updated on his latest writings.
Before we officially sign off, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, building directly on the macro-historical framework the author has laid out for us. Riker frames this entire sociological phenomenon as the Gynocratic cycle. But if we look closely at history, cycles don't just stop. They continually turn.
If we are currently at the absolute tension-filled peak of this pendulum swing, exactly as the author suggests, what does human history tell us happens next? Does the cycle eventually self-correct back to a quiet, negotiated equilibrium between the sexes? Or does the societal tension build to such an unbearable degree until the entire institutional structure collapses entirely, forcing a chaotic hard reset of civilization? It is a heavy concept, but it is something to deeply think about the next time you look at the institutions operating all around you.